Agriculture produces the house you live in, the chair you sit on, the clothes you wear, the food you eat, and the job where you work. Welcome today to the Farm Bureau Farmtastic Agventures Soil and Tree Google Hangout. My name is Alex Tuggle, and this is Shelby Faulkner. We are pre-service agri-science teachers from The Ohio State University. Today we will be your hosts for today's Hangout. This morning we would also like to welcome Jennifer Barnett, Office Administrator from Jefferson County Farm Bureau, who is serving as our Tech Coordinator, Wendy Zadansky, Natural Resources Specialist for Jefferson Soil and Water Conservation District, and Randy Klum, Klum Forestry Consultants. Both are featured in the Tree and Soil Ag Mag that you have received. Let's welcome all of our classrooms and teachers on our Hangout today. When I recognize your classroom, please give us a wave so we know where you are. First, we'll start off with Miss Adams' class from Winchester Trail Elementary. Thank you. Next, we will do Miss Blackford and Miss Loomis's class from Sandy Valley Elementary. Thank you. And Miss Carver's class from Sandy Valley Elementary. And finally, Miss Sedlak's class from Sandy Elementary. Welcome to all of you. Now let's get started. First, we will have Wendy Zadansky with our lesson on soil.
Conservation District. And for those of you that don't know what a Soil and Water Conservation District does, our job is to help landowners or people that use the land figure out ways to help protect their natural resources and make them sustainable for future generations. And when we say sustainable, we mean to help preserve them and keep them intact so that, or even improve them so that they're better than they were before. So that's my job at the Soil and Water Conservation District. I work a lot with different farmers in particular, putting in practices to help them improve their water resources and their soil resources. And I work a lot with soils in our county. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I think that I'll start off by saying why soils are an important natural resource. So a lot of times I think that we take soils for granted. You know, when we think about natural resources, a lot of times we think about water resources because those are the ones that are always in the news and they're the ones that we use the most. We know that we need to protect our water resources and keep our water clean. And so we focus a lot on water. But the soil resource is just as important, and a lot of times we kind of take that for granted because it's not something that you can really see all the time. So if you look behind me, there's a hillside here. And you know that there's dirt underneath that grass, but you don't really, maybe we just don't take the time to explore what that resource is and what we can do to improve it. And maybe we don't even realize what it really does. So soil is important, of course, for many reasons, but the first one is that without soils, we wouldn't be able to produce the food that we need for the people across the world. So soil is important to grow agricultural crops that help to feed nations. And the population of the world is growing, so those soils are going to be ever more important. And then soils also, farmers raise food to feed livestock that feed people, so we're still going back to the soil. Another reason that soils are important is that if you see all the beautiful trees behind me, all the beautiful trees in the places that we live, without good soils, we're not going to have good, healthy trees, which is going to affect our timber industry, and Randy will talk about that a little bit later. So soils is important to our tree species or any plant that grows on top of the ground. And then finally, soils are important, of course, as filtering groundwater nutrients, or nutrients out of pollutants out of groundwater. So we need good soils to help filter water and keep it clean, and then also soils are needed for good structure. So you're sitting in a school building right now, you were in your bed in your house this morning, you drove to school on hopefully a good solid road. So those structures are all built on soils. So without good, strong soils, we cannot have the structures that we need that keep us safe every day and that we take for granted. So everything comes back to the soil resource, and there's only a limited amount of soil in the world. So the more that we abuse it or lose it, the harder it is to put back. It can take as much as 500 years to form an inch of topsoil, and it can take a minute to wash it away. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So we can't really talk about soils. I could talk about soils without these, but you really aren't going to see what I'm talking about unless I show you a picture of what I'm talking about or I bring in a soil sample. So these are two soil samples that were taken not too far apart, maybe just a couple feet apart, and they're two very different looking soils, even though they're the same soil type. So what I have here is what I would call a good healthy soil. So this would be an undisturbed soil. It's not the best. I mean, we can get really good versions of soil, but you know, this is generally undisturbed. It's never been tilled over. You can see that we have a lot of plant cover on top and that the roots are starting to penetrate down into this layer. So if you looked in your ag mag, it does tell you about the different soil layers. It tells you there's a topsoil layer and then a subsoil layer and then a parent material layer. So the topsoil layer is generally about a foot deep, and I don't have the other layers with this because it would have been a really long dig. So this is just the topsoil layer, and as you can see, the roots are penetrating all the way down through this. Right beneath this would be the subsoil layer, which has less root penetration and less nutrient concentration. But in this topsoil layer, this is an extremely important component of the soil. So a lot of times people think about soil as being just dirt. What you don't really think of it as being is a living organism. So we often refer to soil as being healthy or unhealthy, and that is because soil can be sickly, because there is a lot of life in this soil. So if you ate cereal for breakfast this morning, and I'm going to use the Captain Crunch reference because I know that Randy will use it in his talk later. If you had a bowl of cereal, and maybe it was Captain Crunch, if you used a teaspoon to eat your cereal, did you know that if you took that same teaspoon and dug into this soil right here, that there would be more microorganisms or living things in that teaspoonful of soil than there are people on the earth? And that's just one teaspoonful. So imagine how many microorganisms are at work in the soil beneath our feet every single day. And those microorganisms include bacteria, algae, you have macroorganisms too, ones that you know about, earthworms, centipedes, all kinds of creatures that are microscopic and that are living in the soil, working to help in this relationship between the soil and plants every day. So here we have a root that I'll use for example. This root has something, a new word you guys might not know. It's called the rhizosphere. And what that is a little, it's like a whole world around this particular root. So when this is in the ground and fully functioning, in this rhizosphere, there are microbes and microorganisms working in that area, and they are using this plant root and this plant as shelter and as a food source. And then they, in return, they all have a job. Each one eats different things. Each one makes its own products. So what they're doing is returning the favor by making nutrients available to this plant and also helping to improve the soil. So they're working together. So in what we call a good healthy soil, the microorganisms are helping the plant grow and grow better, and then the plant is helping give them shelter and cover. So they're working together. So that's what we want to look for in a healthy soil. And the microorganisms are the most important thing. And so the best way to keep the microorganisms happy is to make sure that they have food and shelter. And in nature, you find that there's a diversity of plants because each one likes a different thing. So there's very rarely, if you looked even at the grass, it all looks like grass, but there are many different kinds of plants in there. So they all work together to make a better ecosystem. So this is an example of a soil that I wouldn't consider as healthy. This one was near this in its actual landscape position, and this one has been tilled over, it's been run over, it's been compacted, there's very little plant cover, and it doesn't have a lot of structure. I tried not to pick this one up too much because it will just tend to just fall apart. There's very little holding it together. This one, on the other hand, I could stand it up. I probably could even jump up and down on it, and not that much is going to happen because it has good soil structure. And what I mean by structure is what gives the soil stability, and it gives the microorganisms a chance to do their thing. So this one has good structure. It's more stable. It has good cover. So that is why this is the goal, and this one really isn't. It's kind of like, I used the example in the earlier Google Hangout that if you could put a cabin somewhere when you get older, so you would probably want your cabin to be somewhere in a setting like this. lots of beautiful trees, plenty of green grass, you're getting a lot of water, just somewhere that's very lush and picturesque. You probably would not, and that would be what I would call this area. You probably would not want to put your house on a desert soil, for example, because it doesn't have good structure. It's kind of sandy. It might not hold up real well. There's not going to be a lot of trees. There's not going to be a lot of water. So, you know, this is like a green park, and this is like the surface of the moon, essentially. So to a microorganism living in here, you know, they're going to want to live here as opposed to living in here, because it's very hard for them to do what they need to do. It's just so dense and so compact. There's very little roots that are able to penetrate. They can't get what they need, and if they aren't there, they're not giving plants what they need, and so there won't be any plant life. So that's kind of how we break these two things out. So real quickly, I'm going to talk about another thing that you may or may not have heard about, and that's erosion. So a lot of my work in soil and water is to help farmers or loggers or anyone that's using the land, anyone building a house, prevent soil from eroding away. We don't want to lose our soil resource. As I said, it takes an inch of 500 years for an inch of topsoil to form, and in 1 minute it can just wash away. So we have to do things to try to protect that from happening. So there are ways that we can do that. So just real quickly, erosion, what it really is that if it were to rain and a raindrop were to hit this particular dense compacted soil that has no cover on it at all, that raindrop is going to, as it starts to rain, it's just going to start to slough off this soil a little bit, and the raindrop is going to carry that soil away with it into our creeks and streams. And it's also going to carry away with it anything that soil has attached to it, be it fertilizer, pesticides. You know, if there's nothing to keep it there, it's just going to wash away. And I know you're thinking, one raindrop, big deal. How much damage can one raindrop do? But if you multiply that by millions of raindrops coming at a very high force, you'll start to notice that, you know, so the next time it rains and you're going to school, look in the creeks when it's raining really hard, because that water, as all that rain is hitting soil types like this, it's just running off and it's picking up soil with it until basically it just wears it away. So in this particular instance where we have a lot of cover and it's starting to rain down on this, when a raindrop hits this, it's hitting all of this leaf litter. And when it hits this leaf litter, and because there's good structure here, it's losing some of its velocity, so it's not even hitting the soil essentially. And then when it does finally filter into the soil, it just gradually penetrates down in, instead of just hitting this, taking soil with it, and shooting right off. So it's a good way to picture erosion. And like I said, there are ways that we can reduce erosion by trying to keep as much cover on the soil surface as possible. And just to mimic how it looks in nature. You know, nature doesn't leave things looking like this. In nature, if this were to sit out for very long, weeds would start to grow. And even though it's weeds, weeds are still some kind of cover. So nature's always moving covered up. So it's just a little quick lesson about soils. I mean, there's so much more to talk about, and I know that you guys are going to have questions at the end of this. So just keep some of those thoughts in mind if you have any questions. And right now I'm going to turn this over to Randy so he can kind of pull it all together with some things about forestry, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you. Now we'll have Randy Klume, a forestry consultant, speak about trees.
Hi, everyone. Well, Wendy did a great job talking about soils. Now we're going to talk about a larger organism that occupies our landscape, and those are trees. So what I'm going to do is talk about how forestry, and people all come together and interact in our environment. First off, my name's Randy Klume. I'm a professional forester and a graduate of The Ohio State University. I studied natural resources, specializing in forest resource management. First off, I think we have to ask ourselves, what's a forest? And a forest is a collection of trees. It can be all kinds of different trees. A lot of the species will depend on what Wendy was talking about as far as soils, soil productivity, and the depth of the soil. If it's moist, wet, there's all kinds of variations and factors that depend on what kind of trees grow in the soil. Next thing, once we've defined what a forest is, then what is a forester? Seems logical that a forester is somebody that studies the forest and also, in my case, help manage the forest. One of the things we learned about trees is how do trees function? By that I mean, how do trees work? We know for us to survive, we have to have nourishment like Captain Crunch at breakfast, a good home environment, a healthy environment. We have to keep healthy so we don't get sick. We have to have a roof over our head, protection and shelter, and then most often and emotionally is the aspect called love. Trees need soil, they need a good healthy environment, and as we put more stresses on the planet, that also stresses trees. One of the wonderful things, or I should say tremendous things about trees, is how they benefit us as a society. And I want to go back to the basics and talk about photosynthesis. If you break down photosynthesis, it's just a real fancy word for light process. Photosynthesis is a light process that happens in not only trees, but anything that is green, anything that has chlorophyll and chloroplast. So let's start with the photosynthetic process and how important it is. I call photosynthesis the equation of life because how it benefits us, and I'll explain that in just a minute. Trees have this amazing capacity to take in carbon dioxide, which is a natural occurring element in the atmosphere, combine it with water in the form of vapor, and under a certain amount of energy from the ball of fire in the sky called the sun, creates sugar, and the byproduct of this whole thing is oxygen, which we need. So plants are self-sustaining. They make their own food. And this is where I come in. How can we manage the forest to benefit human beings? I'm going to go back to Wendy. Stop and think about how many different forest products we use every single day. It's actually mind-boggling. There's over 5,000 different products we use from trees, but we don't think about. I think one of the most important forest products we use is a thing called 2-ply Charmin toilet tissue. We take that for granted, but it's often necessary. But when we get up in the morning, we might put our slippers on. Our feet might hit a wooden floor that came from trees. We might mosey out to the breakfast table that might be made out of wood, open up a wooden cabinet door and get a box of Captain Crunch. If you analyze the Captain Crunch box, it's paper processed from trees. Then there's a plastic bag inside that also could be a chemical that comes from trees. We can actually harvest trees, grind up trees, heat trees, and get many different types of chemicals that benefits us as human beings. But inside that box of Captain Crunch is also a thing that came from the soil that Wendy was talking about. It could be oats, wheat, barley, rye. They're all plant materials. And trees are just large, complex green plants. I, as a forester, try and help the woods and woodland owner by growing and harvesting trees. The reason we harvest trees is I referred to, there's over 5,000 different products that come from trees. Also, if you analyze the population in the world, there's about 7.3 billion people in the world, about 322 million people in the United States, and then this little state of we call Ohio, there's 11.5 million people all competing for forest resources, soil resources, water resources, and air resources. Trees are almost like the lungs of the planet. They can take pollutants out of the air and actually hold them in the wood fiber of a tree. That's called sequestrian carbon dioxide, sulfur oxides, nitrides, can hold all kinds of things in the cell walls of a tree. They also are great filters. Wendy alluded to the plants growing on top. Think of a woods full of trees and how good they are at filtering out the water or slowing the water down. They're just magnificent filters, and also the root system of trees penetrates so deep into the soil and actually can help condition the soil. As Wendy said, with this piece of concrete soil, it's not really concrete, but it's so dense, tree roots have to breathe. Tree roots also have to have water going or infiltrating into the soil to survive. With compacted soil like this, it's very difficult to grow healthy trees. One of our challenges as foresters is to grow trees on strip mine land. And this is a good example. Well, it's a better than a good example of strip mine ground. Strip mine ground isn't even this good because it's packed, it's compacted, it doesn't have any of the fungus and mycorrhizae that some of the roots have, and soil-borne fungus that benefit trees. So we have trees on strip mine ground. It's not it can't be done, it's just challenging because of the density of the soil. Some of the things I want to point out that we might not think about: when you got up this morning and brushed your teeth, hopefully you brushed your teeth, that plastic on your toothpaste or toothbrush handle is more than likely plastic that came from a tree. CDs, like this one, can come from trees. It's called cellulosic plastics. It's another chemical derivative or product that comes from trees. Folding rulers. There's just a whole host of products that comes from trees. We use heat and pressure to mold different parts of wood so we can bend them into chair parts or maybe different furniture parts. But a little heat and pressure can make this look just like this pretzel or a wet noodle. So trees surround us. We really don't think about it, from the cradle, maybe you have a wooden cradle in your home for a little brother or sister, all the way to when we pass away. We might be buried in a wooden coffin. But trees surround our lives on a daily basis. When we measure trees, we don't use weight and inches, we use board feet. And this piece of wood, it's 12 inches this way, 12 inches this way, and 1 inch thick. 144 cubic inches represents 1 board foot. In Ohio, we harvest about 750 million board feet just in our little state. We have some of the finest hardwoods you'll find anywhere in the world in our state of Ohio. Our trees go to make fine furniture and make a house a home. So I'm sure you folks will have lots of questions, and Wendy and I will be more than happy to try and answer them. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you. Now it's time for our classrooms to have an opportunity to ask their questions. So please speak loudly to our presenters so they can hear you. We will take a question from each classroom in order, starting with Miss Adams, then Miss Blackford, then Miss Loomis, Carver, and Sedlak. We will then go back through more rounds of questions. Teachers, if there are audio difficulty, you can also type the questions and they will be answered. So we will start out with Miss Adams' class.
Okay, Xavier, go up there and yay. Xavier, drop down.
There you go.
Look into the. Look at Xavier. Look into the camera.
Yeah. Okay, start talking, Xavier. Don't look at yourself. Come here, honey.
Don't look at yourself. Does soil like die if you just plant a tree or something? Does it die? Does the soil die?
Does the soil die when you plant things on it?
Yeah.
No, actually that helps the soil to live. So the soil needs to be having a relationship with plants. So if you go outside and you plant a plant in your soil, you are actually benefiting the soil and you're benefiting that plant. So that plant is providing shelter and a food source to those microorganisms in the soil, and then the microorganisms are allowing a food source to be given to that plant. So by planting things on your soil, you're helping it to live.
Thank you. Miss Blackford, does your class have a question?
Yes. Dominic, go ahead.
How is hairspray made from trees?
How is hairspray made from trees? It's another one of those chemical components I was talking about, where we can take trees, harvest trees, bring it into a mill, grind it up, and then we put it in a big cooker, and they get different chemicals out of the tree that go into the process of making a hairspray. I would be lying to you if I told you exactly what it was, so I'd have to see the ingredients in hairspray to see which type of ingredient came from the tree. Acetone and acetates come from trees, I know that, but it all depends on what the ingredients of the hairspray, what it says. But that's an interesting question. And I like that idea that you're thinking about different products that come from trees.
Thank you. Miss Loomis, your class is up.
Okay, go ahead, Brandon.
What layer of soil do you need to dig down to plant a tree?
Did you hear that one okay?
How far down do you need to dig to plant a tree?
Yes, and which layer do you need to get down to? Because we'd read about the 3 different layers.
Okay, well, when you stop and think about a tree, first off, what size of tree are you planting? Usually, if you're planting thousands of trees, you're going to be planting seedlings, and they might be as big as this instrument here. And then you're not going to go very deep. You might be going 4 to 6 inches into the ground, and the critical thing there is make sure the roots go straight down and don't curve up, because they have a greater tendency of drying out. And then you have to seal the hole so air doesn't get in there and dry out the root system. Some people will dig up a tree, called it balled and burlap, where they take probably 50 to 7% of the roots. Then you have to dig a much larger hole, and it might be as deep as my waist then. So it depends on the size of the tree you're transplanting more than anything. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Miss Carver's class?
Does the soil ever run out of nutrients from the trees?
Does the soil ever run out of nutrients for the trees? I'll start, and Wendy can back me up. One of the terms we use for that relationship is called a symbiotic relationship. Sounds like a big word, but it's mutually, each one benefits the other. A tree needs the soil for stabilization and to anchor itself, and also it gets certain elements out of the soil. As the tree grows, it returns nutrients to the soil in the form of leaves when they fall down, or pine needles if it's a conifer forest or an evergreen forest, and its twigs come out and decompose. Nothing is wasted in the forest ecosystem because everything's recycled back. So I see as trees, even though they withdraw nutrients from the soil, they actually add nutrients back into the soil as well.
Which is good for trees, but it's not always the case when we have crop farming, for example. So say a farmer plants corn year after year after year, and that corn plant grows, and they take the corn off, and there's another corn plant that comes up, and they take the corn off. There's nothing going back onto the soil to return the nutrients. So unless the farmer is leaving some what we call crop residue by just letting the corn fall down and there's still plant left to decompose, or they're putting fertilizer back on, it is possible to deplete a soil of its nutrients by continuing to take and not giving enough organic matter back. It doesn't happen as much with trees because they are always giving a return back.
There also are certain plants that fix nitrogen back into the soil. They have nodules on them that actually add nitrogen into the soil, and there's several trees that do that. Black locust is one, and the alder family is another. I think soybeans might be a nitrogen fixing plant, but there are plants that actually aid in adding nitrogen back to the soil as well.
Thank you. Miss Sedlak's class?
Good for plants. What in soil is good for plants?
What in soil is good for plants? All of the nutrients that are in soil is good for plants. So there's a little chemistry coming into play, and that's not my favorite subject, but it is part of my job. So the nutrients that are good for plants that we hear about often are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but there's also millions of micronutrients such as calcium and things that are also available to plants from the soil. So this is full of minerals and nutrients, and that is available to plants when there is good, healthy soil activity. There's a lot of other complex factors about why nutrients can bind to soil particles, and we're not going to get into that. But yeah, there are a lot of, we're bringing chemistry into play. There are a lot of things on the periodic table of elements that are available to plants from the soil.
Thank you. We're going to go back to Miss Adams' class.
Make a pie. Please make a space.
Pile. Oh. How many types of soil are in the world?
Oh boy.
Whew, yeah. Which is funny that you even asked how many types of soil there are. I think there was something in your ag mag about there being 400 maybe-ish in Ohio. So across the world, you know that number is going to be pretty big. I know in my county alone, which is Jefferson County, there are between 70 and 80 some soil types. So a lot of people don't even recognize that there are different soil types. When you look out across a field, most people think, okay, that's just dirt. But it's not. There's actually many different types of soil, and what makes them different from each other is what their formation process was, where they are in the landscape. I know that in your ag mag it talked about the different textures of soil. You can have a sandy soil or a silty soil or a clay soil. So each different soil type incorporates different properties. So some are more clay based because they may have weathered from shale. Some may be sandy because they weathered from sandstone. So in terms of the number in the world, I am not sure of that number. Like I said, I do believe in your ag mag. It tells you how many there are in Ohio, but it's going to be a pretty high number. And it's a very good question, and I'm proud of you for recognizing that there were different types of soil.
Thank you. We're going to go to Miss Blackford's class next.
Go ahead, Dom.
What is the best density and texture of soil to plant plants in?
Okay. The best density and texture. Density, in terms of density, so this is something that's very dense. It's so dense that it's just like a big chunk of concrete, like Randy said. So this is too dense to plant plants in. You want something that has more of a density like this. So there's a lot of pore spaces. The pieces will kind of flake off easily. It's nice and crumbly. That's how you want to plant plants, because these roots need that flexibility to be able to grow. If you tried to, for a root to grow in this, would be extremely difficult. So density-wise, you definitely don't want something that's really compact. In terms of what type of texture, sandstone or clay, so sandy soils tend to filter out nutrients really quickly. They're not holding them as well. And clay soils sometimes tend to hold too much water, so they're wet. So somewhere between a silty and a clay would be a good soil type. And each tree species or plant species is adapted to a different soil type. So if you go out west, you'll see some plants grow well on sandy soils. If you go down to a swamp, you'll see there are trees that are growing fine in clay, wet soils. So it just depends on what species you're trying to plant, what texture you would be looking at, or what kind of environment you would be looking at. If you have anything to add to that, feel free.
Well, a lot of times on real dense soil, people are planting cover crops now, like turnips. They might be this big around and this deep, and they help loosen the soil. Also, trees can help loosen that soil because of the structure of the root system and how deep they penetrate, and it just helps loosen that soil up. But that's over a long period of time. But the quickest ones that I've seen are certain cover crops like turnips. And they'll really loosen and help the soil as far as the porosity of it or infiltration rate.
Thank you. Up next, we're going to go to Miss Loomis's class.
How long does it take for the longest growing tree to grow into an adult tree?
How long does it take for the longest growing tree to do what?
To grow into an adult tree.
Well, the oldest living tree on the planet grows in 5 western states in the United States. If we were taking a little field trip to go see the bristlecone pine tree, they can live to be almost 4,000 years old, and there'd still be snow. Well, it'd probably be snowing now up in the mountains. So they grow at anywhere from 8 to 11,000 feet in very harsh, dry soils, and they grow very small amounts every year. You can measure them with like a microscope. That's how small they grow. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. We're going to go to Miss Carver's class next.
We have a lot of strip mine land around our school. Can that land be reused to farm or grow?
Yes, actually, the good thing about soils is that they can always be improved. So if you feel like you have a bad soil or strip mine soil, there are things that we can do to help improve these soils. And Randy touched on that. We can plant things that help to penetrate in the soil and break up the structure a little bit, add root mass. You can always keep it covered with organic matter, and over time, as that organic matter breaks down, it's going to help build the organic layer on top of the soil. So just because we have strip mine soils doesn't mean that they're unusable. Now there are some strip mine soils that have chemicals or things, byproducts that came off as a result of the mining, where they might be a little too acidic to grow anything. So there are going to be some bad areas, but there are ways to treat that as well. So we have a lot of people that think that just because it's strip mine that it's not going to be good for anything, but by using good management and always keeping that soil covered and making sure that there's a good organic matter on top of there and that things are growing in down to improve it, we can improve the soils greatly.
Thank you. We'll now go to Miss Sedlak's class.
What is the most common tree in Ohio?
What's the most common type of trees in Ohio? Well, believe it or not, we're going to go back to Wendy's soil types, and different trees grow in different types of soils. What county are you from that you're asking the question? Are you in Jefferson County, Tuscarawas County, Stark County? Stark. You're at the edge of where the glaciers are, so they did a wonderful job of dumping more topsoil. So there we have a lot of oaks, well, I should say also maples, beech, more deep-rooted species. When we get the hill country over in Jefferson County along the Ohio River all the way down to Portsmouth, we have more sandstone, parent material, and we have more oak hickory forest. A lot of it depends on where the soil is. Where there's the old lake beds, we have more limestone dependent species like ash and red oak, and same thing down towards Cincinnati where there's more limestone as well. So trees grow in different areas for different reasons. A lot of it's parent material or soil. A lot of it has to do with moisture. A lot of it has to do with how high or how low up on the slope it is, how deep the soils are. There's just all these variables depend on what type of trees grow where.
Thank you. We're going to go back to Miss Adams' class.
It's me. Really? Hi there. My question is about my brothers. They farm about 1,500 acres in grain, and they no-till everything. How do we tell the farmers around us, etc., get the word out that no-till is a good way to take care of the soil?
Good question.
Long question.
The best way, I think, to get the word out there is to lead by example. So I've noticed that with, some of my farmers that we do a lot of pasture operations in my neck of the woods, and there's a lot of grazing operations. And I know that if people are managed grazing, if they're rotating their cows, their pasture grasses are improving, and I will have their neighbors call me and say, what is that person doing that it looks so much better than mine? So, leading by example is probably the best way that you can. Another way is just, when you go to meetings and you're out there talking to people, just have them say what the benefits are. I think people are afraid to try things that aren't what they're used to because they're afraid that they're going to fail, or they've heard that other people have failed at doing them. So if they can go out there and say why it works for them, what the challenges have been and how they've overcome that, I think that that's the best way to convince others to do that as well.
If I could add something, they also might say what their fuel savings are, the save of wear and tear on equipment, the number of passes, less soil compaction, and then also if there's any benefits in the yield as far as increase in yield. So it's bottom line is, the economics of fewer passes and the bushels per acre too.
Thank you. We'll now go back to Miss Blackford's class.
Okay, you're up.
How is dye made out of trees?
How is dye made out of trees? Well, that's pretty easy, actually. Certain trees have different chemicals in them. They're natural chemicals, like black walnut. Have you ever tried to peel a black walnut? Your hands will just be dark as ink. Indians used to use that as a dye. Certain internal woods are red, some are yellow, and the Indians, well, and even today, we'll use those, but now we have synthetic processes that are much quicker and probably cheaper than using trees. But we learned a lot of those processes from the Native American people through trial and error and hundreds of years of figuring it out, use different species of trees for dyes. Is that a good enough explanation?
Yes. I think.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Thank you. We'll now go to Miss Loomis's class.
You, Isaac. Go ahead.
What and where is the oldest tree in Ohio?
That is a good question. I can't answer that directly, but I can tell you this. In Ohio, we keep a registry of champion trees, and these are the largest trees of their species, and they're recorded by county, the size and everything. I can also tell you that white oak will live longer than any other tree species in the state of Ohio, and it will approach 400 years and better. It can live that long. But to pinpoint the oldest tree, I cannot do that. There used to be the Logan elm, where Chief Logan signed a treaty with the English Europeans that settled here in, I think it was Pickaway County, just near Circleville, and that tree was 200 or 300 years old when I saw it, but it's long gone now. The trees can live for an incredibly long time, or incredibly short time if we abuse them.
And if you guys are curious about that tree registry that he mentioned, it's on the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Division of Forestry's website. So, and keep it close ear out, because sometimes soil and water conservation districts will partner with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources to put out a big tree contest every year, so that people in their counties can help to find the biggest and oldest trees. So I'm quite disappointed, because Jefferson County, where I'm from, we don't have a tree on that list yet, and I know that there's probably some. So ears peeled for that, because you guys might be able to find one of Ohio's biggest and oldest trees.
Thank you. We'll now go to Miss Carver's class for a question.
Can you grow trees without soil?
That's a good question. I don't know how to answer that. I suppose you could for a certain amount of time. Smaller living organisms like tomato plants and other plants you can, but I couldn't answer that honestly. I don't know if you know, Wendy, or not, but I don't think you could, because it needs support, and the soil offers an anchor for the roots and all the nutrients it needs to support that. That's a good question. I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry.
Thank you. We'll now go to Miss Sedlak's class for a question.
Why does it take so long for a tree to grow?
Okay, that's a good question. So, how old are you?
11.
11. Okay, I'm a little older than you, about almost 5.5 times as old as you. Every year, a tree puts on a ring of growth, and I don't know if you'll be able to see that on here, but this little tree right here is it's right at 50 years old. This tree is only 7 years older. The growth rate of trees, we can increase the growth rate of trees by managing trees. And by that I mean, if we cut trees away from them and let the top of the tree get bigger, remember the top of the tree has chlorophyll and chloroplasts in it. It takes in more carbon dioxide and water, and as the tree top expands, it can make more sugar to grow faster. So since you're only 11, it might seem like an incredibly long time, but as adults, time is a little different for us because we've lived a little longer. But it just takes a while for these trees to get to accumulate these rings on the tree. But like I said, we can grow trees almost 2 to 3 times faster by cutting other trees around it, letting it get more sunlight, more moisture to grow faster.
Thank you. Anita, do you have any more questions?
I'm sorry, I had to unmute. I do have one. So is harvesting trees good for the environment? And if we do harvest trees, should we replant them?
That's a very good question. Harvesting trees is good for the environment from the standpoint of it takes less energy to convert a round tree into a usable form of material we can use. If you try to make something out of steel, aluminum, even recycled aluminum, concrete, or glass, it takes a tremendous amount of energy to produce those products in relation to a wood product. So that way, trees are environmentally green from the standpoint of energy consumption to make a product. The other nice thing about trees environmentally is we can grow new trees in our lifetime. Trees will also benefit the environment from the oxygen produced, the pollution it pulls out of the air and holds it into the cell walls. It's homes to all kinds of birds and animals. It's a filter for the water to purify it as it goes into the ground. So there's not many green building materials we can use that offer all these attributes or all these fine things in the environment. You had a second question. Oh, do we need to replant? In certain situations, like strip mine situations, if we want to revert that environment back to trees, we will plant trees. If the ground's too steep to farm, that would be a good place to plant trees. But when we harvest trees in the woods, and we harvest about 750 million board feet every year in the woods, generally in Ohio, we do not replant because every year in the springtime, trees flower. Those flowers produce seeds, whether those helicopter seeds from the maple trees we called samara, or a little paddle-like seed that comes off the ash tree, or maybe it's a hickory nut, an acorn, or a walnut. Every year, millions of seeds are produced on every acre of ground where there's forest. What those seeds need are a good rooting medium like Wendy's soil here and enough sunlight and intensity to warm the soil so that seed will germinate. So generally speaking, in Ohio, we hardly ever replant after we harvest because there's so many seeds in the forest soil.
Thanks. We have one last question. What education or training have you gone through to get your job, and what's your favorite part of your job?
Okay, so I started this off last time by saying when I was a kid, I just wanted to be outside. And I didn't really know what kind of careers were available to me out there until I was in high school. And then I had an outdoor class, and then I also participated in the environmental competition, and I realized that there were lots of careers out there. I didn't just have to go to work for a state agency somewhere. I could work as a private job somewhere else as well. So my passion when I got out of high school was actually forestry, but it didn't offer more than a 2-year degree, and I had wanted a 4-year degree at the schools I was looking at. So I ended up going to Kent State University, and I got a 4-year degree, a bachelor's degree in conservation, which was a very broad-based topic. I mean, we covered everything. It was forestry, wildlife, soils. We pretty much covered every aspect of being outside. So that is why I settled on that major, and so that's my educational background. And then what do I love about my job? I just love working with people that are passionate about natural resources. And I said in the last class, you know, I was so excited when I found out I was getting to do a Google Hangout with Randy because we're both very passionate about natural resources and helping people who want to learn about natural resources and manage their resources. So that's the best part about my job.
Okay, I went to Ohio State University and spent some time at the University of Montana. And ever since I was probably about 12 years old, I knew I wanted to work outside, much like Wendy. And when I got to Ohio State University, I thought, well, I'm going to be in wildlife management. I thought, I just love wildlife, and I want to help different species of wildlife recover from the brink of extinction, like bald eagles and grizzly bears and trumpeter swans, and river otters and black-footed ferrets and things like that. But when I talked to my professor, he said, there's no jobs in wildlife. So I thought, I'm going into forestry because then I can manipulate wildlife habitat. And forestry is a really broad-based education, much like Wendy's, because you talk about hydrology, which is the study of water and the movement through the soil. You talk about insect and disease, which is pathology and entomology. You talk about accounting and economics. Is it economically feasible to grow trees in our lifetime? You talk about different ways of managing trees. But paramount is math, physics, and chemistry. That's stuff we all love to hate, but I love math. And basically, we're just doing volume. Trees are just nothing more than a big cylinder, and we're figuring out the volume in those cylinders. But as far as why I like what I do, I think, and Wendy probably does too, we're making a difference in the environment in a positive way. By managing the resource, we're helping the people in Ohio and the United States and even the world as far as our natural resources and the promotion of natural resources and the education of natural resources. And working with people, Wendy and Michelle behind the camera and all the great people that own this country is just marvelous. So that's why I like what I do.
Well, thank you for sharing. It's time to wrap up our 5th Google Hangout of the year. Farm Bureau has provided you with a wonderful soil and tree ag mag that gives you some great information. Be sure to go to the suggested activities on the back page that gives you some fun activities and websites you may want to visit. Be sure to take it home, read it, and share it with your family. Thank you to all of our teachers and students who participated today, and Jennifer Barnett for her work scheduling and trial runs with the teachers. Thank you to Farm Bureau and everyone who made this experience possible. And special thanks goes out to our presenters, Wendy Zadansky and Randy Klum, who joined us today. Teachers, be sure to go online and sign up for our upcoming Farmtastic Adventure Pizza Pizzazz. For more information, go to agventures.hangout@gmail.com. And remember, agriculture produces the house you live in, the chair you sit on, the clothes you wear, the food you eat, and the job where you work. See you next time and have a great day.
All right. Here. I know.